The rope had already been knotted when Clara Whitmore stepped forward and threw down every coin she had left in the world. The year was 1873, and the town of Harlow Creek, Colorado, sat baked and restless beneath a June sky the color of hammered copper. It was a Tuesday, which mattered to nobody except the preacher who had already delivered his brief, disinterested last rites to the man standing on the gallows platform. The crowd that had gathered along the dusty main street was the usual mixture of the bored and the bloodthirsty, men in worn suspenders and women who held handkerchiefs to their mouths not out of sorrow but out of habit. Children perched on fence rails, dogs lay in the shade, and up on that rough-hewn platform of splintered pine, with his hands bound behind him and a noose resting against the side of his jaw, stood the largest man Clara had ever seen in her 28 years of living. He was enormous. That was the first and most unavoidable fact about him. He stood at least 6 feet and 3 inches, broad across the shoulders in a way that made the 2 deputies flanking him look like boys playing at being lawmen. His hair was the dark brown of river bark, thick and overgrown, falling past his jaw in unkempt waves that the morning wind stirred without ceremony. His jaw was square and covered in a heavy beard that had gone unattended for what appeared to be many weeks. His arms, even bound as they were behind his back, were visibly corded with muscle, the kind that came not from vanity but from years of hard and necessary labor in places where the land offered no mercy. His shirt, what remained of it, hung open at the collar and was torn at one shoulder, revealing skin mapped with old scars and new bruises from however he had come to stand in this particular spot on this particular morning. His eyes, when Clara finally forced herself to look at them, were a pale and startling gray, and they were not afraid. That was the second unavoidable fact. He was not afraid. He stood on that platform and looked out at the crowd, the way a man looks at a horizon he has already decided is not worth his concern. There was no pleading in his expression, no searching the faces of strangers for mercy. There was only a kind of massive and dignified stillness, like a mountain that has accepted winter. Clara had not come to town that morning intending to buy a man off the gallows. She had come to settle her account at Deering's general store, purchase a sack of flour and a tin of coffee, and return to the homestead before the afternoon heat made the road back unbearable. She was a widow, had been for 14 months now, and the farm that her late husband Edmund Whitmore had left her was not so much a farm as it was a collection of problems held together by stubbornness and her own 2 hands. The land was good, the soil deep and dark, but it needed working that one woman and an aging hired man named Santos could not adequately provide. The fences were half down, the creek drainage needed clearing. The barn roof had developed a leak she had patched twice already with insufficient success. She needed help in the deep and practical sense, and she had not the first idea how to get it. But then she had rounded the corner by the millinery shop, flour already purchased and tucked under one arm, and she had seen the platform and the rope and the man, and something in her chest had done a thing she could not easily explain. It was not romance. It was not even kindness in its simplest form. It was something older and more stubborn than either, a refusal that came up through her boots from the ground itself, a refusal to walk past a man being killed for reasons she did not yet know, a refusal that felt as involuntary as breathing. She had pushed through the crowd to the front. She had listened to Sheriff Dale Pruitt read from the charge sheet in his flat and self-important voice. Colm Maddox, accused of claim jumping, assault of a deputy, and the destruction of property belonging to the Harlow Creek Mining and Cattle Consortium. The consortium. Clara knew the consortium. Every person in this valley knew the consortium, and most of them knew it the way you know a toothache or a bad winter, as something that caused suffering and could not be easily escaped. The consortium was headed by a man named Garrett Finch, who owned the biggest house in 3 counties and had managed to place his interests above the law with a frequency that would have been impressive if it were not so infuriating. And now a man was going to hang for crimes that, in Clara's experience of how Garrett Finch operated, may well have consisted of nothing more than standing on ground that Finch had decided he wanted. She had acted without a plan, which was unusual for her. Clara Whitmore was, by nature and by the harsh education of widowhood, a woman who made plans. She planned meals and repairs and planting schedules. She planned how to stretch $1 until it cried. But in that moment, standing at the foot of the gallows with the sun on her neck and the blood pounding in her ears, she had not planned anything at all. She had simply said, loudly enough for the sheriff to hear, "I will buy his indenture." The crowd had gone quiet in a specific way, the way crowds go quiet when something unexpected has introduced itself into the proceedings. Sheriff Pruitt had looked at her from the platform with the expression of a man who has been interrupted mid-sentence by a cat walking across his papers. He was a lean man in his 50s with a silver mustache and the slightly watery look of someone who drank more than he admitted to. He had known Clara for years, had tipped his hat to her husband at church, and now he regarded her with something between confusion and impatience. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said, with the careful pronunciation of a man trying not to be rude because she was a widow, and widows were due a certain courtesy in polite society. "This is a hanging, not an auction." "It can be both," she said. She reached into the flour sack, which was where she kept her money because she did not trust the local bank since it had failed her neighbor Beatrice Holt 2 years prior. She pulled out the leather purse she kept folded inside. She did not count it publicly. She set it on the edge of the platform and said, $42.70, his indenture for a period of 1 year. He works off the debt to the consortium on my property, and the charges are commuted. That is within the law, Sheriff Pruitt, and you know it." It was within the law. It was an old provision, one of those creaking legal instruments that existed more in theory than in practice, but it was real, and Clara had known about it because Edmund had once explained it to her while reading from a territorial law book he had ordered from Denver for reasons she had never fully understood but had always appreciated. The provision allowed for the commutation of certain civil and property-related charges if an interested party agreed to take financial responsibility and employ the accused in a supervised capacity for a specified term. It was not a common arrangement, but it was legal. The man on the gallows had not moved. He had not looked at her. He was still looking at that uninteresting horizon. There was a long silence, during which Sheriff Pruitt had a visible argument with himself. Clara could see it happening on his face, the weighing of Garrett Finch's displeasure against the inconvenience of being seen to violate his own legal obligations in front of the entire town. Garrett Finch was powerful, but the town had eyes, and those eyes were watching. "The charges include assault of a deputy," Pruitt said. "The deputy," said a voice from the edge of the crowd, "threw the first punch. I saw it." This was old Vera Massey, who ran the laundry on the north end of town and was about 70 years old and afraid of absolutely nothing. Several people murmured agreement. Pruitt's jaw had tightened. In the end, he had taken the money. The noose had been removed from around the man's neck with somewhat less ceremony than it had been placed there. His wrists were cut free. He had been walked down the platform steps by Deputy Clarence Hopper, who looked disgusted about the whole arrangement and delivered to Clara with the approximate enthusiasm of someone handing over a broken tool. The man had stood before her in the middle of the dusty street, a head taller than anyone nearby. Blood from a cut above his eye dried into a dark line along his cheekbone, his gray eyes finally focused on her instead of the distance. Up close, he was even more overwhelming in sheer physical presence. She was a tall woman herself, and broad-hipped and full-figured in a way that had once made her self-conscious, until Edmund had told her she was the most beautiful woman he had ever seen, and had meant it. But she had to look up at this man, and the looking up felt significant in some way she declined to examine in public. "Colm Maddox," he said. His voice was deep and unhurried, the voice of someone who chose his words because he meant them rather than because he was expected to produce them. "Clara Whitmore," she said. "You work my land for 1 year. You eat at my table and sleep in my barn. You do not steal from me. You do not drink yourself useless, and you do not cause trouble in town. Are we agreed?" He looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense that he was doing some kind of internal accounting, measuring things she could not see. "Agreed," he said. That was how it began. The road back to the Whitmore homestead was 7 miles along a track that wound through scrubby juniper and open grassland, climbing gently toward the foothills where the land grew darker and richer and the views reached out for 50 miles. Clara drove the wagon. Colm sat beside her on the bench because there was nowhere else for him to sit, and the proximity of him was its own kind of weather. He was quiet in the way mountains are quiet, not empty but full and self-contained. His hands rested on his thighs, big hands, knuckled and scarred and calloused in patterns that spoke of axes and ropes and stone. He stared ahead at the road. After a mile or so, Clara said, "What did you actually do?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. "Garrett Finch's men came onto land I had been working for 3 months," he said at last. "The claim was registered. Mine. His men said it belonged to the consortium, that there had been a filing error. I told them to get off my land. They sent the deputy. The deputy made a mistake." He paused. "I made a bigger one, probably. Hitting the deputy. Not hitting him. Hitting him in front of witnesses Finch could bribe." He shifted slightly on the bench, and even that small movement communicated a physical power that was almost startling. "Your $42 was the most expensive mistake I ever made somebody else fix." "You can pay me back," she said. "That is rather the point." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, almost a smile, but not quite. "I intend to." Santos was waiting in the yard when they pulled up, leaning on a fence post with the mild and unreadable expression he always wore when something surprised him. He was a Mexican man of about 60, wiry and sun-dried, and possessed of an extraordinary competence that had made him invaluable to the Whitmore farm through 3 hard winters. He looked at Colm Maddox the way a man looks at a piece of equipment he is trying to assess for usefulness. "This is Colm Maddox," Clara said, climbing down from the wagon. "He will be staying and working. Santos, can you show him where things are?" Santos looked at Colm. Colm looked at Santos. Some transaction passed between them in silence. "The barn needs mucking," Santos said. "I have done worse," Colm said, and that, in its simple practicality, was that. That first week was a revelation, though Clara tried not to call it that, because revelation suggested that she had been expecting one, and she had been expecting nothing beyond basic competent labor. What she got was something considerably more. Colm Maddox worked the way weather works, with a consistency and force that simply did not stop. He was up before the sun every morning, and by the time Clara came out with coffee, he had already done 2 hours of work. The first thing he did, without being asked, was the barn roof. He had assessed it in his first 10 minutes on the property, wordlessly climbing up to examine the damage with a thoroughness that Santos had always intended to match, but never quite managed. He spent a day and a half on that roof, and when he was finished, it did not leak, not that afternoon when the summer rains came, not ever again as long as Clara lived on that land. Then the fences. Then the creek drainage, which he understood at a glance, required not just clearing but restructuring, and he dug and redirected and rebuilt in a manner that suggested he had done this kind of engineering before in far more demanding circumstances. Where had this man come from? The question turned itself over in Clara's mind as she watched him work from her kitchen window, telling herself she was watching to ensure he was not stealing anything, knowing perfectly well that was not the truth. She knew the broad facts from what he offered in small pieces during meals, because meals were the one time he seemed to permit conversation. He was 34 years old. He had grown up in the Appalachian Mountains of Virginia, had come west at 20 with nothing, and had spent 14 years moving through the Rockies, trapping and mining and cutting timber, and doing everything that the mountains required in exchange for the privilege of living among them. He had been a trapper until the trade dried up, a miner until the strikes played out, a logger until an injury to his knee had kept him out of the camps for a season. He had filed his claim in the Colorado Territory with the specific intention of settling, growing things, building something that would last. Then Garrett Finch had decided he wanted the land. "Do you have family?" Clara asked one evening, when the long summer dusk had softened the sharp edges of the day, and they were sitting on the porch with the remains of supper cleared away, and Santos had retired to his small cabin near the horses. Colm was quiet for a moment, his large hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee. The fading light caught the line of his jaw, the breadth of his shoulders, the way he sat as though the chair had been built specifically to hold something of his size. "Had a brother," he said, "James. He died in the war. Confederate side, which was not a choice I agreed with, but he was my brother." He paused. Parents are gone. I have no one waiting anywhere. I'm sorry, Clara said. There are worse things than solitude, he said, and she could hear in the way he said it that he had told himself this many times and was still in the process of deciding whether it was true. Are there? She asked. He looked at her for a moment, really looked at her, and she felt the weight of that gray gaze like something physical, warm and direct and serious. I am working that out, he said. She went inside shortly after and stood at the kitchen window for a long time without any particular purpose. The summer deepened, and the work between them developed its own rhythm. Clara ran the domestic operations of the farm with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it alone for over a year and had stripped everything non-essential from the process. She kept a large kitchen garden, preserved and dried and pickled against the coming winter, managed the small accounts and correspondence that the farm required, and handled the business affairs that periodically required trips to town. Colm and Santos handled the outdoor work, but it was increasingly Colm who set the pace and direction of it, because Colm seemed to understand instinctively what a piece of land needed, what it was asking for if you were willing to pay attention. He had a gift for it that surprised her. She had expected brute strength, and she had received that in generous measure, but she had not expected the intelligence behind it. He walked the fields the way a doctor walks a ward, observing, considering, arriving at conclusions that he then enacted with calm precision. He noticed that the south pasture was developing a drainage problem before it became serious and addressed it. He noticed that the water level in the main well was declining and researched with Santos the possibility of drilling deeper or redirecting from the creek, arriving at a solution that Santos later said he would not have thought of in a year of trying. He was not easy to know. That was the honest assessment. He was not unfriendly, not unkind, but he wore his solitude like a second skin, and getting past it required patience and a willingness to accept that silence was often his preferred form of communication. Clara had patience. She had developed considerable patience in 14 months of managing grief and a struggling farm and the many small humiliations of being a woman alone in a territory that was not always generous to women alone. And she found, to her own surprise, that his silences did not bother her. She had grown accustomed to a different kind of quiet after Edmund died, the quiet of absence, of a house that felt subtracted from itself. This was a different kind of quiet. It was the quiet of presence, of someone who chose not to speak because he was thinking rather than because he had nothing inside him. There were other differences from Edmund that she noted, and then tried to stop noting because the comparison felt disloyal. Edmund had been a gentle, scholarly man who had loved books and had been quietly, persistently terrible at almost everything a Colorado homestead required. She had loved him fully and without reservation, and his death from a riding accident in the spring of 1872 had taken something from her that she was not certain would ever come all the way back. But Edmund had never filled a room the way Colm Maddox filled a room. He had never looked at her the way Colm sometimes did, with that gray-eyed directness that said he was actually seeing her rather than a general impression of her. She told herself these observations were merely the natural result of close proximity and said nothing to indicate them. July arrived with a heat that pressed down on the valley like a hand, and with it arrived trouble. The trouble came in the form of 2 men on horses appearing at the edge of the property on a Thursday afternoon when the sun was at its peak. Clara was in the kitchen garden when she saw them, and something in the way they held themselves, loose and deliberate and unannounced, made the skin on the back of her neck pull tight. They rode through the gate without stopping to announce themselves, which was not how a person with good intentions arrived at someone else's farm. Colm was at the well, pulling up a bucket, when the men rode into the yard. He set down the bucket with a deliberate and unhurried movement and straightened to his full height, and Clara, watching from the garden, saw both riders adjust their posture slightly in response to the sheer fact of him standing there. The taller of the two, a rangy man with a red bandana and eyes the color of dirty water, said, "We are looking for the widow Whitmore." "I am here," Clara said, coming through the garden gate and brushing soil from her hands onto her apron. "Mr. Finch sends his regards," the man said, and he was smiling in the way that men smile when the smile means something different from what a smile is supposed to mean. He would like to discuss the possibility of purchasing this property. He is prepared to offer a fair price. I have received Mr. Finch's letters on this subject, Clara said. My answer has not changed. The second man, shorter and heavier, with a face that looked like it had been sat on at some point, made a show of looking around the property. Pretty isolated out here for one woman, he said. Things can go wrong on a farm this size. Accidents happen. The silence that followed this statement was broken by the sound of Colm Maddox crossing the yard, which took less time than seemed geometrically possible given the distance. He came to stand beside Clara, not in front of her, not blocking her, but beside her, and the effect of him standing at full height next to her was such that the rangy man with the dirty water eyes actually moved his horse half a step backward. "The lady has given her answer," Colm said. His voice was entirely calm, which somehow made it more effective than if it had been raised. "You have heard it. Now you will leave." Dirty water eyes looked at Colm for a long moment. Clara could see him doing the calculation, the same one all men did when they encountered Colm Maddox, the rapid and involuntary physical assessment, the arrival at conclusions that generally involved reconsidering whatever they had been about to do. "Mr. Finch will not be pleased," the man said. "Mr. Finch can send another letter," Clara said. "He is welcome to that much postage." They left. Clara watched them go until the sound of hoofbeats faded into the general noise of wind in the grass. Then she let out a slow breath. "They will be back," Colm said beside her. "I know," she said. "Finch has been trying to take your land. For 8 months, since Edmund died." She turned to look at him. "He wants the water rights. The creek runs through the back of my property, and if you control this land, you control the water distribution for 3 neighboring farms. He has bought 2 of them already." Colm was quiet for a moment. Something moved in his expression, complex and darkening. "He also has my claim," he said, "or what he took of it." "I know," she said. She had known since the day she pulled him off the gallows, had known that Finch's interest in Colm Maddox was likely the same as his interest in her, the removal of someone who stood between him and something he wanted. The understanding sat between them, unspoken until now, and the speaking of it changed something in the air. "I will not let him have this farm," Colm said. It was not a boast. It was a statement of intent, delivered with the flat certainty of someone who has decided a thing and will not be moved from it. Clara looked at him for a moment and felt something warm and complicated move through her chest. "I am not asking you to fight my battles," she said. "I know you are not," he said. "That is not why I said it." She went back into the house and stood at the kitchen window again, and felt the warmth in her chest refuse to cooperate with her best efforts to reason it away. The next several weeks passed in a weave of ordinary work and quietly accumulating awareness. There were no more visitors from Finch's men, though Clara knew better than to take the absence as reassurance. She had written to the Territorial Land Office in Denver about the status of her water rights documentation, which Edmund had registered, but which she had been told in one of Finch's letters contained a disputed filing. The reply, when it came, was non-committal and slow, which told her that Finch had friends in Denver too. Meanwhile, the farm flourished in a way it had not since Edmund's early optimistic years. The creek drainage work Colm had done was already visible in the health of the back fields, the grass coming up thicker and greener, the soil holding moisture longer in the dry spells. He had repaired not just the barn roof, but the entire structure of the barn's main beam, which Santos quietly admitted had been worrying him for a year. He had built a new hen house that was significantly more predator-resistant than the old one, which had cost Clara 12 chickens to a fox the previous winter. He had done all of this without being asked, simply looking at the farm and seeing what it needed, and doing it. One evening in late July, Clara brought supper out to the porch because the kitchen was too hot to sit in comfortably, and they ate together in the cooling dusk as they had been doing more frequently, and Santos joined them as he sometimes did, and the 3 of them sat in a companionship that had grown itself quietly and without announcement from the practical necessities of shared labor. Santos said, during a natural pause in the conversation, "You 2 are the strangest pair I have ever watched try not to look at each other," Clara said. Santos. Santos looked at his beans with an expression of perfect innocence. Colm said nothing, but the silence he offered was, Clara thought, a somewhat different silence than his usual ones. It had warmth in it. After Santos had gone to bed and the night had settled fully around them, with the stars sharp and excessive overhead in the way they only are at elevation, Colm said, "He is not wrong." Clara said nothing for a moment. The admission was large enough that she needed a moment to receive it. "He is often inconveniently perceptive," she said at last. "Clara." He said her name for the first time without anything attached to it, not a greeting, not a preface, just the word itself, and the way he said it made something in her go still and careful. "Yes," she said. "I would not ask for anything," he said. He was looking at the stars. "I am here under an obligation, and I will honor it regardless. I would not want you to feel that any feeling I might have could be used to demand something from you or put pressure on you that you did not want. I have thought carefully about whether it was right to say anything, and I have decided that saying nothing is also a choice with consequences, so I am telling you." He paused. His hands were folded in his lap, those big scarred hands, and they were very still. "I have come to care for you, in a way that is not about the obligation, that is separate from it." Clara sat with this for a moment that felt longer than it was. "How long have you been composing that speech?" she asked. A pause, then quietly, "Approximately 3 weeks." She laughed. She had not laughed, she realized, not genuinely and without effort, in a very long time. It came out surprised and warm, and completely without calculation, and she felt it loosen something in her chest that had been tight for 14 months. "I care for you as well," she said when the laugh had settled. "I have been very diligently trying not to." "Why?" he asked, and the question was genuine, not rhetorical. "Because it frightens me," she said honestly. "Edmund was good and gentle, and I loved him very much, and losing him was the worst thing I have ever survived. And you are not gentle, Colm. You are not careful in the way he was. You are like something that belongs to the mountains, and I am afraid that caring for you is like caring for a storm." He turned and looked at her fully then, and the gray eyes in the starlight were something she did not have a word for. "I will not leave," he said, "unless you send me away. That is all I know how to promise, but I mean it all the way down." She did not reach for his hand that night, but she thought about it, and the thinking felt like the beginning of something she had not given herself permission to begin. The trouble with Garrett Finch announced itself more formally in August, when a letter arrived from a lawyer in Denver informing Clara that the Harlow Creek Mining and Cattle Consortium was initiating a legal challenge to the water rights documentation on her property, and that a hearing would be held in Harlow Creek in the second week of September. The letter was written in the ornate and dense language that lawyers favored, but the substance of it was simple. Finch was going to try to take the water rights through the courts, having apparently decided that sending men with implied threats had not worked. Clara sat at the kitchen table reading the letter twice, and then setting it down with the careful precision of someone who does not want to throw it. Colm read it when she handed it to him. His expression did not change significantly, but she had learned to read the small changes, the slight compression of his jaw, the almost invisible narrowing of his eyes. "The filing date," he said. "Edmund registered the rights in 1869, she said. "The documentation is all here. I have it. Finch will argue that the filing was improper in some technical sense. He will have a lawyer who knows what to look for." He set the letter down. "You need a lawyer, too." "Lawyers cost money," she said. "So does losing your water rights." He looked at her directly. "I can cover the cost." "You cannot. You came here with nothing." "I did not come here with nothing," he said, and something in his voice shifted in a way she could not immediately read. "I came here with what I had on my back, which was not much, but there is money." He paused, seeming to come to a decision. $1,200 in a bank in Pueblo. I had it there before the trouble with Finch started, intended for buying equipment for the claim." Clara stared at him. "You have $1,200. "I have worked in the mountains for 14 years, he said simply. "I do not spend much." She shook her head slowly. The information rearranged several things she had been assuming. "Colm, I cannot take your savings." "Consider it a loan," he said, "at reasonable terms, which I am happy to discuss or not discuss, depending on what you prefer." The look he gave her when he said this carried a weight that had nothing to do with interest rates, and she felt the warmth move through her again, inescapable now. "We will discuss it," she said. "I will not simply take it." "Fair enough," he said. He rode to Pueblo the following week to arrange the transfer, 3 days on the road in each direction, and Clara was surprised by how much the farm felt different in his absence. Not diminished exactly, but returned to its previous version of itself, the version where the quiet was absence rather than presence. Santos noticed. He said nothing, but he noticed, and his failure to make a comment about it was its own kind of comment. When Colm returned on a Thursday evening with the dust of the road on him and a receipt from the bank in his pocket, Clara was on the porch, and she stood when she saw him coming up the track, and she was partway across the yard before she fully realized she had walked toward him. He stopped his horse and looked down at her, and the look on his face, surprised and careful, and something else, something open and undefended, was the most unguarded she had ever seen him. "Everything all right?" she asked. "Everything is fine," he said. "I was not expecting you to come and meet me." "I was not expecting to," she said honestly. He dismounted and they stood close in the evening light with the warm smell of horse and distance on him, and she had a powerful and unnerving impulse to put her hands against his chest, to press her palms against all that warmth and solidity. And she did not do it, but the impulse itself told her something she had perhaps been willfully ignoring. "I missed this place," he said. His voice was quiet. "This place missed you too," she said, and meant it entirely literally and not literally at all. He looked at her for a long moment with those gray eyes. "Clara," he said, and the way he said it this time had a question in it. She rose on her toes and kissed him on the cheek, just there at the corner of his jaw where the beard grew thick, and his breath caught audibly. She stepped back and said, "Go wash the road off you. Supper is almost ready." She went back inside and stood at the kitchen window with her heart running faster than she would have liked, and a smile on her face she did not try to control. The lawyer his money engaged was a man named Franklin Cole from Pueblo, who turned out to be sharp and methodical and considerably less frightened of Garrett Finch than the local attorneys who had all, one by one, found reasons to be unavailable when Clara had inquired. Cole arrived in Harlow Creek 10 days before the hearing, reviewed all of Clara's documentation, and told her that the filing was in fact entirely proper, that Finch's legal argument rested on a technicality so obscure it amounted to an argument made in bad faith, and that he was confident in the outcome provided they had a judge who was not in Finch's pocket. This last condition was the variable that worried Clara most. The hearing was set before Judge Anson Hale, who had been in Harlow Creek for 2 years, and whose reputation was, at best, ambiguous. He was not an obviously corrupt man, but he moved in Finch's social circles and had been seen at Finch's dinner table, which said enough. Colm, who had spent the weeks leading up to the hearing continuing to work the farm with his usual unrelenting consistency, and who had also apparently been doing something else in the evenings that Clara had not been fully tracking, produced on the evening before the hearing a written statement from Vera Massey, from the miller Thomas Greer, from the banker Josiah Pruitt, who was the sheriff's brother and the one honest member of that family, and from 4 neighboring farmers, all attesting to the long-standing and publicly acknowledged nature of the Whitmore water rights, the community's awareness of them, and the character of Garrett Finch's pattern of behavior in the valley. Clara looked at the stack of papers and then looked at Colm. "You have been doing this for weeks," she said. "I have been talking to people," he said. "Neighbors talk to people they trust. I helped the Greer boy with a broken wheel last month. I helped Mrs. Massey with a drainage issue on her side of town. I helped the Kellerman brothers bring in their hay early when the weather looked uncertain." He paused. "People are willing to do things for people they trust, and Finch has not made himself beloved in this valley." She reached across the kitchen table and put her hand over his. He turned his hand over and closed his fingers around hers, and they sat like that for a moment in the lamplight, her small hand inside both of his big ones, and she felt something so complete and solid settle over her that it was almost alarming in its intensity. "Thank you," she said. "I told you I would not let him have this farm," he said. "You did," she said. He raised her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles in a gesture so gentle it seemed almost impossible coming from someone built the way he was, and she had to look away at the window because the feeling in her chest had grown large enough that she was not sure she could hold it without it showing on her face in a way that felt too raw for the lamplight. The hearing the following morning was attended by essentially the entire town, which was partly due to general interest in a legal drama, and partly, Clara suspected, because enough people had heard about Finch's methods and were quietly hoping to see the outcome go a different way for once. The room above the sheriff's office where court was periodically held was packed and airless and smelled of boot leather and tobacco. Franklin Cole was excellent. He was precise and thorough, and he laid out the documentation with a clarity that left no genuine ambiguity about the legality of the filing. When Finch's lawyer, a man named Hargraves from Denver who wore his suit like a weapon, attempted the technical argument, Cole dismantled it so methodically that there was an audible intake of breath from the gallery. Then, Cole submitted the community statements. Judge Hale read them with the expression of a man who had been hoping the evidence would be thin enough to allow him to be dishonest, and was disappointed to find it was not. He read all of them, including Vera Massey's, which was brisk and unequivocal in the way that only the statements of 70-year-old women who have stopped caring what anyone thinks of them can be. Garrett Finch himself was present, sitting in the front row in a black coat and hat, a tall man of about 50 with silver-streaked hair and the kind of face that has been handsome long enough to become accustomed to cooperation. He watched the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who was calculating rather than worried. Occasionally he looked at Clara, and occasionally, with considerably more measurable discomfort, he looked at Colm Maddox, who stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his gray eyes steady, taking up space in a way that seemed to make the room smaller. Judge Hale ruled in Clara's favor. The eruption of sound from the gallery was immediate and unambiguous. Hargraves said something sharp to Hale about appeals, and Hale, who perhaps had come down on the right side and was now committed to it, said in a voice loud enough to carry that the matter was settled and he would not revisit it. On the steps of the building afterward, Clara stood in the bright August sun and felt something she had not felt since before Edmund died, the feeling of standing on solid ground, the feeling that the thing she had built and was building was actually hers and would remain so. Colm came to stand beside her, and she turned and looked up at him, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. Then he said, "How does it feel?" "Like the ground stopped moving," she said. From across the street where Finch was getting into a carriage with Hargraves, she saw Finch look at them both with an expression that was not friendly, but was, she thought, beginning to contain the first traces of something that might eventually develop into acceptance. He was a man accustomed to winning, and losing was educating him, slowly, in the possibilities of the world. Santos appeared from somewhere in the crowd and said without preamble, "Can we go home now? There are still fences to check." Colm laughed, and the sound of it, full and unguarded, was something Clara collected quietly for herself. Autumn came to the Colorado foothills with a seriousness of purpose that demanded respect. The aspens turned gold, and then shed their gold like a decision, and the mornings acquired a cold that went from pleasant to insistent over the course of 3 weeks. The farm moved into the rhythms of preparation, the laying in of wood and feed and food for the long winter ahead, the work that has no endpoint but only the gradual accumulation of readiness. Colm was everywhere in this preparation, and by now the farm had taken on a character it had not had before, the character of a place that was being properly maintained rather than held together with temporary solutions. The wood was cut and stacked in a quantity that made Santos walk around it and look satisfied for 10 minutes. The root cellar was organized and full. The animals were in good condition, the horses well shod, the cattle healthy. One afternoon in late September, a cold, clear day with the high peaks already showing snow above the tree line, Colm found Clara in the back field, attempting to mend a section of fence that kept failing at the same post, a job she had been meaning to ask him to do and had gotten to herself, because waiting felt worse than doing. He came and stood beside her and took the post from her hands without ceremony, and set it properly in a way that would actually hold, and she stood watching him work and realized with a clarity that was almost inconvenient that she was in love with him. Not the fond, accumulating affection she had been admitting to, Not the warmth in her chest she had been carefully parceling out, something fuller and simpler and considerably harder to manage. She loved the way he worked, the intelligence and care of it. She loved the way he looked at her, as though she was both known and interesting. She loved his silences, which she had come to read the way you read familiar weather. She loved that he had collected character statements from half the town over the course of months without saying a word about it. She loved that he had offered his $1,200 without making her feel diminished by the offering. She stood in the cold September air, looking at him, and felt the love settle into her like water into soil, complete and permanent and ready to grow things. He finished with the post and turned to find her looking at him. "What?" he said. "I love you," she said. She had not planned to say it quite then, but there it was, said, real, out in the clean autumn air. The stillness that came over him was different from his usual stillness. It was the stillness of someone receiving something he had not permitted himself to expect. "Clara," he said, and this time the way he said her name was a whole sentence. She took one step toward him, and then he covered the rest of the distance himself, 3 long strides, and then his arms were around her, those enormous, strong arms that could carry timber and dig wells and fix anything, and he held her with the same care with which he did everything, completely and with his whole attention, and she pressed her face against his chest and felt the solid, steady pound of his heart against her cheek, and breathed him in, the smell of work and cold air, and him, specifically him, unmistakable. "I love you," he said against the top of her head, and the words came from him the way all his words did, considered and certain and meaning exactly what they said. They stood there in the back field with the golden mountains above them and the cold wind moving through the dry grass and the whole afternoon falling slowly into evening around them, and it was exactly as complete as it needed to be. That winter was long, as Colorado winters are long, but it was not the same as the previous winter had been. The previous winter, Clara had spent in a house that felt too large and too quiet, managing her grief with the methodical efficiency she brought to everything, eating alone at a table set for one, lying awake in the hours before dawn with the particular silence of absence pressing in from all sides. This winter, the house was warm in a different way. Colm slept in the barn, as he had always done, because the arrangement they had started with remained the arrangement they maintained, both of them careful, both of them aware of what the valley would say about a widow and a man living otherwise, and both of them, it had to be said, moving with a deliberateness about their relationship that had nothing to do with social convention and everything to do with the fact that they were both people who took serious things seriously. But he ate every meal at her table, and the evenings were spent together more often than not, he reading from the books she had inherited from Edmund's small but excellent collection while she sewed or worked on correspondence, and the silence between them had become so companionable that Santos, who ate with them on Sundays, had stopped making comments about it entirely, because it had moved past the stage where comments were appropriate into the stage where it was simply how things were. He kissed her properly for the first time in November, on an evening when the first heavy snow of the season was coming down outside the kitchen window, and the house was warm with the smell of stew and wood smoke. He had come in from checking on the horses, and she had handed him a cup of coffee, and their hands had overlapped on the cup, and neither of them had moved. And then he had set the cup down on the table and cupped her face in both his big hands with a gentleness that she felt all the way down to her feet, and kissed her, slow and certain and warm, the way he did everything, completely and with his whole attention. She kissed him back with everything she had. He rested his forehead against hers afterward and said nothing for a long moment. "I should ask you something," he said finally. "You should," she said. Her voice was not entirely steady. "Not tonight," he said. "I want to do it properly. I want to do it right." "All right," she said, and the waiting felt like a kind of luxury, like having something to look forward to in the deep of winter. He asked her on Christmas Eve, which she would later tell people was so perfectly cinematic of him that it was almost unfair. He had made Santos his co-conspirator, which Santos had apparently been delighted about, and Santos had distracted her with a very theatrical complaint about one of the horses while Colm arranged the kitchen with candles and the good china that she rarely used and a small posy of dried wildflowers from the summer garden that she had forgotten about, but which he had noticed and saved for exactly this purpose. When she came back inside and saw it all, she had to stop in the doorway. "Colm," she said. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen, clean and combed and wearing his best shirt, which was a significant departure from usual. He was so large in that small, warm room, like the mountains trying to be domestic, and it was the most endearing thing she had ever seen. He did not get down on one knee, which he would also tell people later, because he said afterward that his knee had been giving him trouble, and he did not want to add unnecessary drama to the occasion, and which made her laugh so hard she had to put her hand on the wall. He held out to her a ring that he had made by the jeweler in Pueblo during his trip in August, a simple gold band with a small inset of turquoise, which he told her later he had chosen because the color reminded him of the Colorado sky in summer. "Clara," he said, and his voice was steady because he had decided this and was certain of it, "I came to this valley with nothing, and I found everything. Will you marry me?" She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put her arms around him as far as they would reach, which was not all the way around, and said yes against his chest, and felt him breathe out something large and long-held with a sound that she felt more than heard. They were married in February in the small white church in Harlow Creek, on a day when the temperature was well below freezing and the snow was 6 inches deep on the road, and exactly 31 people showed up anyway, because 31 people in this valley had decided they had a stake in this happiness. Santos stood beside Colm. Vera Massey sat in the front pew and wept with the apparent pleasure of someone who has been right about something for a long time. Clara wore a dress of deep blue wool that she had made herself over the course of 2 months of patient winter evenings. She was warm and full-figured and beautiful, and when Colm saw her coming down the aisle, the expression on his face was one that 31 witnesses would describe in various ways over the following years, but which amounted to the same thing: a man receiving the precise thing he had not known he needed until it stood before him. The preacher, a young man named Elliot Graves, who was new to Harlow Creek and not yet caught in any particular power structure, performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and an admirable absence of the droning quality that afflicted many of his profession. "I will," said Colm, when the appropriate moment arrived, and the 2 words came out of him with such absolute and unambiguous certainty that the woman in the 3rd pew spontaneously began to cry. "I will," said Clara, and meant every syllable. Colm kissed her in a manner that was perhaps slightly longer than strictly ceremonial, and nobody in the building seemed to object. They spent their wedding night at the farmhouse because there was nowhere else reasonable to go in February in Colorado, and Santos had thoughtfully removed himself to a friend's place in town for the occasion, and the house was warm and the snow was falling outside, and inside was everything that mattered. Spring came, and with spring came change. Colm had been thinking about the land all winter with the focused and patient attention he brought to everything, and in March he sat down with Clara at the kitchen table with a piece of paper and worked through what he proposed. The farm as it stood was adequate but not prosperous. To make it genuinely profitable, to make it the kind of operation that would sustain a family and potentially grow, it needed additional acreage. The quarter section adjacent to their eastern boundary had come available the previous autumn when its owner, a bachelor named Ket, had given up and gone back to Ohio. The land was cheap because it was considered difficult, too steep on one end and too wet on the other, but Colm had walked it 3 times and understood what it needed, and believed it could be made productive with the right drainage work and the right crops. They bought it with the remainder of his $1,200 and began the work in April. It was during this work, during the expansion and the digging and the planting of the new acreage, that the valley watched Colm Maddox with a different kind of attention than it had watched him before. The story had circulated, of course, as stories do in small valleys. The widow who had bought a man off the gallows, the mountain man who had fixed her fences and saved her water rights and married her. People had varying opinions about the specifics, as people always do, but the opinion that mattered and was most widely held was that Clara Whitmore had done something remarkable in throwing down $42.70 on a Tuesday morning in June, and that the something remarkable was in the process of repaying itself in ways that nobody had quite anticipated. Colm repaid it in the most immediate and practical sense. The farm had never been in better condition, the land had never been better managed, and the Whitmore holdings were now larger and more productive than they had been even in the most optimistic years of Edmund's original venture. He had also, in some less easily quantifiable sense, repaid it in the way he had stood beside Clara in every particular, in the Finch business and in the daily accumulation of all the small and large things that a partnership requires. He did not diminish her. He did not substitute his judgment for hers in the things that were properly hers. He did not take over. He augmented, and the distinction was one that Clara valued in a way she did not have adequate words for. What shocked people, which was the word they used, the word that went around the valley and came back to Clara in various forms from various mouths, was the totality of it, the sheer completeness of how he had repaid her. Not just the farm work, not just the legal battle, but the way he was with her, the way he had simply decided she was worth everything and acted accordingly. Women in the valley told each other about it in the way they told each other things they wanted to be true about the world. Men looked at Colm Maddox with expressions that were complicated, because he was not an easy man to dismiss and not an easy man to imitate, but there was a kind of respect in it that was also complicated and genuine. Garrett Finch, for what it was worth, had not given up entirely. He had attempted 2 more small legal maneuvers over the course of the winter and spring, both of which Franklin Cole had dealt with at a distance, and there were rumors that he was losing interest in the Harlow Creek Valley specifically and redirecting his attention toward opportunities further south. The consortium did not formally acknowledge defeat, but its representatives had stopped appearing in the valley, and the neighbor properties that had already been swallowed by it were being managed badly and beginning to show it. There was a conversation happening among several valley landowners about whether those properties might be purchased back at fair prices from a consortium that was demonstrating increasing signs of overextension, and Colm was a quiet and influential voice in that conversation. The summer of their first married year was the most beautiful Clara could remember, which she was aware was partly a product of being happy, and that happiness improves the recall of seasons. But the practical facts of it also supported the assessment. The new acreage was producing well beyond what even Colm had projected. The existing farm was running with a smoothness that felt almost effortless from the inside, and the house itself had been added to in a significant way by late June, when Colm had quietly spent 3 weeks building an addition onto the eastern side with lumber. He had milled himself from timber on the new property, a large, light-filled room that he had designed with windows facing both east and south, and which he presented to Clara by simply taking her hand one afternoon and walking her to the new door and opening it. She had stood inside the empty room, with the summer light pouring through the windows onto the clean plank floor, and understood what it was before he said anything. "For whatever it is used for," he said carefully from the doorway, "it is yours to decide." She turned and looked at him, standing there with his big hands on the doorframe, watching her with those gray eyes that she now knew contained every version of his feeling, and she smiled at him. "Whatever it is used for," she agreed. 3 months later, she told him, on a morning in September, when the aspens were just beginning to turn, and the air had that particular crystalline quality that belonged only to Colorado autumn, that the room was going to be used for something very specific. He was at the table when she came in from outside, drinking his morning coffee and looking over a list of things to be done before the first hard frost. He looked up at her when she came in, read something in her expression that he could not yet name, and set down the coffee slowly. She told him. He was very still for a moment, completely still, and then he stood up and crossed to her and put his arms around her with a care and a completeness that was different from any way he had held her before, a new kind of holding, and she felt him breathing against her hair, slow and deep. "Are you well?" he said. His voice was rough in a way she had not heard before. "I'm perfectly well," she said. He pulled back and looked at her face with an expression that was everything he was, certain and careful and open and deeply, deeply glad. "Good," he said, and then, after a moment, "I should probably build a crib." She laughed, and he smiled, and Santos appeared in the doorway, looked at them both for exactly 2 seconds and said, "Finally," and went back to his work. The winter that followed was the warmest Clara had spent in the Whitmore farmhouse, which had nothing to do with temperature. She grew larger and more comfortable with herself as the months passed, and Colm was attentive in ways that she periodically had to ask him to moderate because she was perfectly capable of splitting her own kindling, thank you, but which she nonetheless found deeply, privately wonderful. He would not let her climb ladders after November. He carried things. He was up in the night checking the stove more than was strictly necessary, and she knew it, but said nothing because the sound of him moving through the house had become as necessary to her rest as quiet itself. Santos had also settled into a kind of glowing satisfaction with the state of things that expressed itself in the production of an extraordinary quantity of excellent food, as though the correct response to pending new life was to fill every available surface with something nourishing. The child, a boy, arrived in May, which felt entirely appropriate, given that May was when the valley announced itself most completely, when everything that had been held in reserve by winter finally released itself into the world. The birth was attended by Mrs. Harker, the midwife, and by Santos, who sat outside the door of the new room and did not speak for 3 hours, which was unprecedented in Clara's experience of him. Colm was present in the room because Clara had told Mrs. Harker that he would be, and Mrs. Harker had raised both eyebrows and then apparently decided it was not her business. He held Clara's hand through the entire process with an absolute steadiness that she drew on every time the steadiness within herself wavered. When the baby came, when the crying erupted into the warm May morning, and Mrs. Harker said, "A boy, Mrs. Maddox, a healthy boy." Clara turned her head and looked at Colm's face, and saw there something she had no word for, something that made every other expression she had ever seen on that face look like a preliminary draft. He held the baby with the same care he brought to everything fragile and important, enormous hands cradling the small weight with an absurd and beautiful gentleness, and he looked at his son and looked at Clara, and said, in a voice that was barely voice at all, "Thank you." "Thanks, Santos," she said, exhausted and entirely happy. "He started cooking 3 days ago." They named the boy Edmund James Maddox. Edmund for the man Clara had loved and lost and wanted to honor. James for the brother Colm had loved and lost in a different kind of violence. Both names sat together well, Santos said when he heard it, which was the most direct compliment he ever paid anything. Edmund James Maddox proved to be a child of substantial and cheerful opinions, which became apparent approximately 6 hours after his arrival, and did not moderate significantly over the following years. He had Colm's gray eyes and Clara's broad, warm face, and an absolute certainty about what he wanted at any given moment that came, Santos maintained, from both of them in equal measure. Colm was exactly the father Clara had somehow known he would be. He was not soft in the indulging sense, because he understood that children needed the same kind of honest engagement that good land needed, not false ease, but genuine attention. But he was endlessly patient in the way he explained things, crouching down to Edmund's level to show him how a tool worked, or how a plant grew, or why the water ran the direction it ran, and Edmund, who had his father's serious attentiveness combined with his mother's quick questions, drank it all in. The farm continued to grow. The eastern acreage proved even more productive by its second full year than the first. A neighboring property did, in the end, come partially available when the consortium's overextension became a foreclosure, and they purchased 12 more acres at a price that was more than fair. Colm had by this time established such a reputation for land management and honest dealing in the valley that 3 other homesteads specifically requested his advice on their own operations, and the modest consulting arrangement that grew from this added something to the farm's income that was small but consistent. Vera Massey died in the winter of 1875 and left Clara her house in town because she had no relatives, and she had told Clara the previous spring that the person who stood up at the gallows deserved something from the people who had benefited from the ripple effects of that action. The house was old and needed work, but it was solid, and Colm spent 2 weeks of the following spring making it livable, and the Maddox family thereafter had a place to stay when business required nights in town, which it periodically did. The most significant thing that happened in the following years, from the perspective of the wider valley, was what happened with the consortium land. Garrett Finch had, by 1876, indeed redirected his attention entirely southward, and the properties he had swallowed in Harlow Creek Valley fell into the hands of a bank in Denver that had no particular interest in them. The bank was willing to sell at reasonable prices to get them off the books. Colm, who had been watching this process with the same patient and forward-looking attention he brought to everything, had quietly spent 18 months talking to people, assessing the properties, calculating what they were worth and what they would need, and building the case for a community land purchase. The Harlow Creek Valley Cooperative, as it came to be called, was not Colm's idea alone, but he was its most persistent advocate and its most effective voice, because people trusted him in the way they trusted anyone who had shown them, over time and through specific actions rather than words, that their interests were being considered alongside his own. The cooperative purchased 4 properties from the Denver Bank over the course of 1876 and 1877, and those properties were farmed collectively, and the profits distributed among the member families according to a formula that Colm and Clara worked out together at the kitchen table over several evenings. It was this, more than anything else, that people in the valley would later point to when they told the story of what had happened since the widow Whitmore had thrown down $42 on a Tuesday morning. Not just the rescue and the marriage and the farm. The whole valley had changed, slowly and irrevocably, because one woman had refused to walk past a man being killed for someone else's profit, and that man had turned out to be the kind of person who understood that what you built mattered more than what you owned. Clara was 33 in the autumn of 1877, and she was looking at the second planting in the eastern acreage with Colm one afternoon in early October, when she told him that the room would be used again. He looked at her the same way he had looked at her the first time, completely still and then not still at all. 2, he said. 2, she confirmed. He picked her up, both hands at her waist, which she had long since stopped protesting, and turned in a slow circle with her lifted against his chest, and her hands pressed on his shoulders, and the October sun throwing gold across the whole dark richness of the field around them. "Put me down," she said, laughing. "In a moment," he said. He put her down gently and kept his hands at her waist and looked at her with his whole face open, all that gray-eyed certainty and warmth and the thing she had never had a word for and had eventually decided did not need one. "I love you," he said. "I know you do," she said. "That is the most reliable thing in my life." "Good," he said. "That is exactly what it should be." The second child was a girl, born the following spring on a morning that arrived with more drama than strictly necessary, in that the March snowstorm that had begun the previous night had not stopped, and the road to town was thoroughly impassable, and Mrs. Harker could not come, and it was simply Colm and Santos and the knowledge that this had been happening without assistance since long before doctors had existed. Colm was, under pressure, exactly as calm as he was under every other condition, which was to say, completely. Santos, who had seen a great deal in 60-odd years of living and was not given to ceremony, was steadier than might have been expected for someone who had spent the previous 4 hours doing complicated things in the kitchen. And Clara, who was the one doing the actual work, was fully aware that being frightened was a luxury she did not have time for. The girl arrived with the snow still coming down outside, and the stove roaring and Colm holding Clara with one arm and receiving his daughter into the world with the other, and the look on his face when he handed the screaming, red-faced, absolutely perfect baby to Clara was one that Clara kept in her private interior collection for the rest of her life. They named her Rose Elena Maddox, for no family obligation this time, just because the name was right. Santos sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and looked out at the snow for a long time before he said, very quietly, that it was a good name. Edmund, who was by now a toddler of substantial confidence, was presented with his sister with an expression of concentrated evaluation that resolved itself after approximately 30 seconds into approval, and he touched her face with one careful finger, the way he touched everything new and worthy of his attention. That was the family that the Whitmore homestead, which had become the Maddox homestead in name as well as in character, contained by the spring of 1878. It was a considerably fuller household than it had been in June of 1873, when Clara had driven a wagon back from town with a rescued mountain man sitting silent on the bench beside her, and the dust of Harlow Creek hanging in the summer air behind them. The years that followed were years in a proper sense, not a series of crises and resolutions, but the actual long texture of a life built by people who meant what they had chosen and kept choosing it. There were hard winters and abundant harvests, and the deaths of animals that had been part of the farm's character, and the births of animals that would become so. Edmund grew into a boy who had his father's physical presence and his mother's curiosity, and was, as Santos maintained until the day he died, going to cause a very specific kind of difficulty for someone when he was old enough. Rose was smaller and quieter, and more like Colm in the depth of her observations, watching everything with those gray eyes and arriving at conclusions she announced in complete sentences at unexpected moments. Colm remained constant in the way that the mountains he had come from were constant, not unchanging, but fundamentally themselves. He put on perhaps a little of the weight that settled men carry differently from young ones, and the lines around his eyes deepened, and the brown hair acquired threads of gray at the temples, and none of these things diminished him in the slightest. He remained large enough and strong enough that it was always the first and unavoidable fact about him, and he remained quiet in the way that held presence rather than absence, and he remained capable of looking at Clara across a kitchen or a field with that gray-eyed directness that said he was seeing her, and would continue seeing her with the same thoroughness he had brought to everything since the beginning. Clara, for her part, looked at him and felt the same thing she had felt since a September afternoon in a back field when she had realized the truth of it, love as uncomplicated and solid as good soil, the kind that grows things for a long time. They were sitting on the porch one evening in the autumn of 1879, the children asleep inside, and Santos in his cabin, and the whole wide valley spread out below them in the blue and gold of late October, when Colm said something that had been said between them in various forms over the years, but not in precisely these words. "Do you know what the worst thing about standing on that platform was?" he said. Clara looked at him. "Tell me." "Not the rope," he said. "Not even the idea of dying, which seemed inevitable in a way that took the worst of the fear out of it." He paused. His hands were on his knees, those familiar hands, deeply scarred and permanently calloused and completely at rest. It was that I had been building toward something for 14 years, and it was going to end on a Tuesday morning in front of a crowd I didn't know, for a piece of land I'd worked 3 months. He turned to look at her. And then there was the sound of coins on wood and a woman's voice saying something that wasn't what anyone expected. Clara was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know what I was doing," she said honestly. "I acted before I thought." "I know," he said. "That is the part that makes it remarkable." She reached over and took his hand. His fingers closed around hers immediately, as they always did, the same reflex, the same certainty. "Was it worth $42.70? She said. He looked at her for a long moment with everything he was in his face, all that gray-eyed steadiness and warmth and love, and the absolute certainty that she had come to understand was simply how he experienced whatever he decided to be certain about. "I have been trying to repay it for 6 years, he said. "I'm beginning to think I may not be able to." "You have overpaid it," she said, "by quite a substantial margin." "Then you will have to keep telling me when we are even," he said. She leaned against his shoulder, and his arm came around her, and they sat in the October evening with the mountains going dark and purple above the golden valley, and the light from their windows warm against the coming dark, and the sound of their children sleeping inside, and everything that mattered solid and present and entirely real. They were even. They were more than even. What they had was the kind of thing that started in the most unlikely possible way, with a rope and a crowd and a woman who had not thought before she acted, and had grown through work and winters and battles, fought side by side and quiet evenings and laughter and grief and the daily choosing of each other, into something that had taken on the weight and permanence of the mountains that had shaped the man who sat here now, with his arm around the woman who had given him back his life, and received, in return, everything he had, and everything he was, and the long, real, breathing future that stretched out before them like a valley in October, full and gold and completely their own. The following spring, Colm and Clara planted the whole of the eastern acreage in a new variety of winter wheat that a seedsman in Denver had recommended, and the gamble paid off in a harvest that September that was the best the land had ever produced, and Santos walked the cut rows of it with his hands behind his back and a look of absolute satisfaction on his weathered face, and Colm stood at the edge of the field with Edmund on his shoulders and Rose at his feet pulling at the hem of his coat, and Clara came to stand beside him, and the four of them looked out at what they had grown together, and the valley hummed around them in the September warmth, alive and full and theirs. There were two more children in the years that followed. A boy they called Thomas, who was born with Colm's broad shoulders and Clara's stubborn will, and proved to be the most opinionated child yet, which was saying something in that household, and a second girl, Anna, the youngest, who arrived when Clara was 38 and Colm was 43, and who was, from her first hours, possessed of an absolute placidity that seemed to say that she had assessed the household into which she had arrived and found it entirely satisfactory. Anna had her grandmother's wildflowers pressed in a book before she was 4 years old, and would become, in time, someone who cared for growing things the way her father cared for them, with intelligence and attention and the deep conviction that what you put into the soil comes back to you multiplied. Santos lived to be 79, which he seemed to regard as a minor inconvenience, and which everyone else regarded as entirely appropriate for a man of his resourcefulness. He died in the winter and was buried on the property, because that was what he had asked for, on the rise above the creek where you could see the whole valley spread out to the south. Colm built the marker himself from the best timber he had, and the whole Maddox family stood in the February cold and said goodbye to the man who had been there before any of them and had watched them all become what they were. By the time Edmund Maddox was 12 years old, and Rose was 10, and Thomas was 8, and Anna was 4, the Harlow Creek Valley Cooperative had grown to include 9 families and was producing enough collectively that 3 of those families had gone from subsistence to genuine prosperity, and the other 6 were making significant progress in that direction. The valley looked different than it had in 1873. There were more buildings, more fences in good repair, more signs of permanence and investment. The school that had been a one-room affair of uncertain attendance had been replaced by a proper building with 2 rooms and a permanent teacher, and the Maddox children were among its most reliable students and its most reliably challenging questions. Colm had become, by this time, a man the valley deferred to in the particular way it defers to people who have consistently proven themselves over time, not as an authority they submitted to, but as a presence they trusted. He was not a politician and never sought to be. He sat on no official body and held no title. He was simply the person that other people came to when they had a problem that required both intelligence and good faith, and he gave what he knew as freely as he had always given his labor, which was to say, completely. Clara ran the farm's administrative and financial operations with an efficiency that had only grown more effective over the years. She had also, in the time freed up by a farm that was properly staffed and properly organized, begun doing something she had not done since girlhood, which was reading systematically and broadly and following the interests that arose from that reading wherever they led. She had become, without quite planning to, one of the better-informed people in the valley on questions of land law and water rights and cooperative agricultural practice, and the advice she gave to other women in the valley who were navigating similar questions was not just sympathy, but specific and useful knowledge. The Harlow Creek that existed in 1882 was a different place from the Harlow Creek of 1873. Not unrecognizable, not transformed beyond its essential nature, but improved in the specific way that things improve when people decide to invest in them rather than extract from them. Garrett Finch was a distant memory. His consortium dissolved and its properties mostly absorbed into productive and community-owned ventures. The Gallows in the middle of town had been removed, which was not precisely related to the Maddox story, but which felt, to people who remembered that June Tuesday, symbolically appropriate. On a warm evening in the June of 1882, exactly 9 years after the morning that had started everything, Clara Whitmore Maddox stood on the porch of the house that had grown from a widow's farmhouse into something considerably more substantial, and she watched her husband come up from the lower field with Thomas on one side and Edmund on the other, both boys trying to match the length of his stride, and neither quite managing it. He had his hand on Edmund's shoulder, and he was saying something to them that she could not hear, and they were both listening with the serious attention that children give to things they want to remember. He looked up and saw her watching from the porch, and he raised one hand, and she raised hers, and the evening light came across the valley from the west and lay golden on all of it, the fields and the fences and the house and the man and the boys, and the whole ordinary, extraordinary fact of what they had made together. And she thought about a Tuesday morning and $42.70 and a noose that had never been meant for him, and the simple involuntary refusal she had felt in the soles of her boots to walk away from something that needed to be addressed. She had told him once that caring for him felt like caring for a storm. She had been wrong. She had been wrong the way you are wrong about things you have not yet fully experienced. He was not a storm. He was the opposite of a storm. He was the thing that stood when storms passed through, enormous and rooted and permanent, the kind of thing you could shelter against and build beside and lean on in the darkest parts of winter. And he would be there when you straightened up again, gray-eyed and steady and completely himself. He reached the porch and sent the boys inside with a word, and climbed the steps and stood beside her and looked out at the valley the way he had been looking at horizons since before she knew him. But it was different now. It had been different for years because this horizon was also home, and he was a man who had spent 14 years without one and knew what it meant to have it. She put her hand on his arm, and he covered her hand with his, and they stood in the June evening while the light went warm and lower, and the valley settled into the soft blue of almost dark, and the children's voices came from inside, and the horses moved in the pasture, and the creek ran over its proper course in the fields he had restored, and everything was exactly as it should be, solid and real and complete. This was what $42.70 had purchased 9 years ago on a Tuesday morning, when a woman had refused to walk past something that needed doing and had thrown down everything she had without knowing what she was beginning. Not a farm, not a water right, not even a marriage, though all of those were real and valuable and earned. What she had purchased, what they had built together from the raw materials of stubbornness and work and honesty, and the willingness to choose each other every day in every weather, was a life, a whole, breathing, fully inhabited life, the kind that does not end at the story's edge but continues, rooted and growing, into all the years that follow.